One APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm, fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
Annette Magnus, and I'm the Executive Director of Battle-Born Progress. So happy to have you here tonight on this very special day today. Today is Trans Week of Visibility, and today is Trans Day of Visibility. So we wanted to do this special with some of our favorite folks from the community. So the first person I want to introduce is Cy, the Executive Director of Gender Justice Nevada. Their pronouns are they and them. You'll talk to them in just a few minutes. And then Percy Neavez, they are the Youth Resource Specialist from the Center LV, and his pronouns are he and him. So welcome to you both. Thank you both for joining us. Percy, good to have you back again, second week in a row, not to Out in Front, but to one of our programs. And Cy, always great to have you. Cy, I want to bring you in and have you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the mission of Gender Justice Nevada and what you all work on and what you have accomplished over the past few years.
So thank you for having us, Annette. This is it's been an amazing day so far. The whole week has been really great. Let me tell you a little bit about Gender Justice, what we do. We're a local 501c3. We have a couple things that we do. First of all, we educate the public. We train medical providers, teachers, small businesses, anyone who's looking to kind of expand their understanding of not only the LGBTQ community, but the trans community, the non-binary community, what best practices are, how to best support and affirm us, the WPATH standards of care, all of those things. I do a lot of presentations, not only to those places and those businesses, but to college classrooms for folks who are just starting out their careers, either in medicine or therapy or teaching. And then the other part of what we do is empowering people in our own community. So I train folks in public speaking and how to use their own lived experiences in storytelling as a teaching tool. And then we also do a lot of community mobilizing. So we do political power workshops and show folks how they can get involved in the political process, either getting out the vote or testimony, or however we can dismantle the system to, make it really better for everybody who is gender diverse.
And Sai, what does today mean to you? What does today mean for the transgender community? And why is it important to have a transgender week of visibility, but also a day dedicated to this issue?
So turn that down, please. Sorry, I've got kids right now. Joseph, sorry about that. So this day actually came about because the only trans kind of awareness time that we had was the Trans Day of Remembrance, which is where we look at the folks that we have lost through violence, and that happens at the end of the year. And so this is really a day to celebrate not only trans excellence and the contributions that trans and gender nonconforming people have made to society, but to see ourselves and for other people to see us. And it started from a trans person, and it's really about all of us being seen and being heard and people listening to our stories.
Awesome. And Percy, I want to bring you in really quickly. So you work at the center here in Las Vegas. What can you tell us about your work at the center, and what are some of the center's current goals in serving our communities?
I am the youth resource specialist at the center, so I work directly with the youth who are in our Qvolution program. And Qvolution happens every Tuesday from 4 to 5:30 for ages 13 to 17. And we try to keep classes fun. We teach them life skills, board game nights, stuff like that. And as far as goals for the center, we actually just hired a new person onto the team, Wynn Tashman. They're the manager of inclusivity, and I cannot speak highly enough of them. They're going to take the programs that we have to the next level, and they're super. And also in the works, soon to come, is a pharmacy actually on site at the center. So folks will be able to visit our clinic, get tested, and then get their treatment. But then also the folks in the neighborhood and the surrounding community will be able to fill their prescriptions as they need. So that's a really exciting next step for the center.
Awesome. And Percy, I know you had some special events this week to celebrate Trans Week of Visibility. Talk to us about what events you had. I know you had a very special visitor at the center yesterday. So talk to us about what this week has looked like for all of you.
So I'm going to start actually with what happened on Saturday, which was our Gender Fest, and Sai was there for that one as well. It was a collaboration between Gender Justice and the center, and we had a lot of wonderful discussions. We had a medical discussion, we had a trans veterans panel, and then the thing that I was a part of was the youth panel. And we had trans and gender nonconforming youth from our Qvolution group actually talk to adults, therapists, really anyone in the community who wanted to know more about what it's like to be a youth who identifies as trans or as gender nonconforming. And then that was a great event. And then something exciting happened yesterday. The governor paid us a visit at the center. He took a tour of the facility. We got to give him a quick rundown of all the programs that we have. And then he gave the proclamation that celebrated and noted trans youth and just trans folks in Nevada.
And so I want to come back to you on that point. You know, in a climate like we're experiencing right now, we're going to talk about some of this in a minute, what's happening in other states. Why is it so important during a week like this that's celebrating, you know, our transgender community? Why is it important to have elected officials and leaders like the governor speaking out positively about our transgender community and not doing harm like we've seen in other states?
Well, first of all, I feel fortunate that we do live in a state where we have protections in place for trans folks, that we've already addressed things like public accommodations and protecting gender diverse kids in schools. And I think the importance of an elected official or anybody seeing us is then they can better understand us. You know, being visible is really, it's showing people outside of our community, not only that we exist, but how common it is. A lot of times when I give trainings to people, like, let's say nurses, they'll say, you know, I've never had a trans patient. And I say that you know of, because you might not know. So many of us don't disclose things to medical providers or to employers or to landlords for fear of discrimination. And so many of us are closeted in those things because of the inherent danger that we face every single day. To exist and to walk through this world as an openly gender nonconforming person is a very brave act. The more people know us, the more they can't just think that we are people that are far away, that they can demonize and stigmatize. And where I have seen people really change their hearts and their minds is when someone close to them comes out, whether it's coming out as gay or bisexual or pansexual or transgender or non-binary. Once that is somebody who means something to them, whether it's a family member or a colleague, then things change. Their political ideology changes, how they see things, how they navigate conversations change. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes us to be out and to be open, if it's safe to do so, to change people's minds. We've seen that with voting, that when it came to equal marriage, decades ago, nobody was for it. But then all of a sudden, gay cousins are coming out and kids are coming out, and people change their political views because it directly affected the people that really meant something to them.
Absolutely. Bash, I want to bring you in here. Thank you for joining. You're a board member of Gender Justice Nevada. Tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and let us know why you joined the board of Gender Justice and the good work that you all are doing over there. Oh, Bash, come off mute, babe.
My bad. I'm Sebastian, he, him. I've been on the board for a little over 2 years, and I joined the board because I didn't have a community. I was freshly out as trans, and I didn't really have to do any work to build a community as a lesbian. It was pretty easy. But then I lost that community, so I needed to find one, and I found Sai on Facebook, and they invited me, and as soon as I walked in, I kind of was like, oh, yeah, this is what I was looking for, pretty much, and that was it.
That's awesome. So talk to us about the work that y'all are doing over at Gender Justice and some of the stuff that you're most proud of with your work there.
Some of the stuff we're working on right now, besides just kind of getting out of pandemic switching, like Gender Justice we've been doing a lot more work with Trans Pride. I am working on kind of expanding our visibility on the internet, and I was starting a podcast. Now I'm starting a Twitch. We just met another guy who has like a whole bunch of things going on. He wants to come and use our studio. Well, we kind of have a studio thing, like creative studio room, so that we can work on our platforms, the Twitch stream, and I think that's what I'm most excited about right now, is growing our visibility.
That's awesome. Well, we're on Twitch with this show as well, so you're in good company. Make sure you follow us. And
Will
then
do.
I see your Broncos flag behind you. You're in good company there too, because me and Mike are big Broncos fans. So yeah,
Colorado.
love it. You found a family here at BBP, so you're always welcome.
That's awesome.
Sai, I want to come back to you. So, we were just talking about the importance of having supportive elected officials in our state who are not demonizing our transgender community and other communities, minority communities. Around the country in states like Florida and Utah and Texas and yada, 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 we are seeing, just this ridiculous moral panic and legislative attacks from the right on transgender and gender diverse folk. Are we seeing the same movement here in Nevada? And how do we fight back as a state to protect our LGBTQ plus communities here?
So first of all, what we're seeing, and Annette, we see this when one piece of legislation goes through, we see copycat legislation in every other state. And so we're seeing it in Idaho, we're seeing it in Missouri, and it's basically two things they're attacking. One is trans youth. I think people do not want to believe that trans youth exist. And, I've worked with hundreds of young people in the last 25 years of doing this work. I have never met a young person who has affirmed their identity outside of what was assigned at birth and stated that they are trans or gender fluid and then not, right? It's never been a phase. And for my generation, I'm Generation X, I'm in my 40s. When I was a kid, there wasn't a concept of trans youth or being trans. I was a tomboy, so I was allowed to wear boys' clothing and, and explore that. But we just didn't know a lot about young people, identifying in these ways. And now they are, because they're allowed to. We have more expansive language. We have more acceptance. We have medical providers who understand them. And this scares a lot of older people. This scares parents. And they're using kids kind of as a scapegoat. And my problem with a lot of this legislation when they're talking about sports or affirming healthcare is it is rooted in a lot of misinformation. None of us in the trans community are trying to get kids like sex change operations. That doesn't happen. It's not even morally acceptable to do that. What we're talking about is things like talk therapy, maybe hormone blockers, things like that, things that are reversible if needed. So I think a lot of times when people are talking about trans youth and access to healthcare, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. They do not have trans folks in the room when they're writing this legislation. They certainly don't have young people in the room when they're writing this legislation. It reminds me of a bunch of cisgender men writing legislation about abortion and not understanding how pregnancy works. And when we look at the legislation that is attacking people and trans athletes in sports and things like that, again, it's rooted in a lot of misinformation. It's a lot of bunk science. And so when this goes through in certain states, it creates this panic and these culture wars. And decades ago, it was more about, oh, well, we can't let openly gay people be school teachers because then they would recruit kids, and that the gay community is out there to be perverted and things like that. They're doing the same thing right now with trans folks and making us these really evil, horrible people that are going after children. And that's not what any of us want. We want to affirm these kids. We want these kids to grow up. These kids have a higher rate of suicide. These kids have a higher rate of dropping out of school, of being homeless because their parents are not accepting them. And as far as Nevada goes, one of my first phone calls a couple of weeks ago was to one of our legislators. I don't want to put her name out there, but I think I texted you when this happened, and I said, please tell me nobody has drafted any bills yet. And she said nothing so far. So it's looking better here. What's happening here is we're becoming a place where people can come to. People, parents in Texas right now don't know what to do. So they're coming here, and they're coming to states like California where we're not seeing anti-trans legislation. So far, so good in Nevada, but the fear is still there. It doesn't matter that they're going to do stuff here. It's still the message to trans folks that we are not wanted and that we are not good people, and trans kids don't know themselves. And that legislation, whether it goes through or not, is still inherently dangerous because it's the message that's being sent.
Yeah. So Percy, I want to come back to you on that point. We know that legislation, we talked about this last week on our Progressive University. So this is kind of a repeat question for you, but we wanted to get it out to the masses, especially this week. So we know that legislation like the Don't Say Gay insanity bill that is moving through in Florida is harmful to our young people, especially to LGBTQ plus young folk. How important is it for LGBTQ plus youth to have a supportive space and education, specifically, educators who are in their corner or who are supportive and understanding?
It's incredibly important. There have been numerous studies done, and they all show us the same thing. It only takes one affirming adult in an LGBTQ youth's lives to save them. And again, numerous studies are telling us the same thing. And this is really important because LGBTQ youth are more likely to have anxiety, are more likely to have depression or suicidal ideology. So knowing that they have a teacher on campus or multiple teachers on campus that are allies and are willing to advocate for their rights is a game changer, because unfortunately, a lot of the times the students aren't out at home, or they maybe just that's the school is the only space they're allowed to be themselves authentically. And so to have that space is crucial for everything.
That's right. Bash, I want to bring you back in. What strategies can folks use to educate others about the experiences and needs of trans folk or gender diverse people? In other words, how can we prevent people who maybe are uninformed, who have false information or disinformation from being swept up in the propaganda from bigots on the other side? Bash, you're on mute, babe.
Terrible at this. That's a tough question. I'm really not sure how to combat the misinformation other than with more information, louder people more often. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I really don't know, because there's always going to be people who are willfully ignorant, and there's always going to be people who push misinformation on purpose. So the only thing that we can do is kind of just continue to live loudly on our platforms so that people can see us being comfortable in who we are. And, also, making more of an effort to educate our peers instead of like letting it go or brushing it off when we hear something because we don't want to, be that person always creating a kind of tense moment. But we have to do that if we're going to get past, the very, very easy barriers that we have right now are like, people don't even know trans men exist. You know what I mean? Like, that's crazy that people are so afraid of one body part that they don't even think that this might be a thing. You know what I mean? Like, so it's kind of being between a rock and a hard place to figure out how to do that.
Sai, same question for you. And I, just educating folks on what does it even mean to be transgender? I think for so many folks, there's been such harmful rhetoric out there, especially generations maybe that came before us, with the words that they use, with the terminology that they use, just such harmful rhetoric that existed around the transgender community. And how do we do better as younger generations to fight back against that stigma, against that fear that exists for some strange reason, and really help people understand what being transgender actually means?
So, it's interesting because when I do trainings, the biggest thing people want to know is terminology. And, I always talk about the alphabet soup that comes along with LGBTQ, that there's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of different labels. I think it's a great thing that we have gotten so expansive with the language we use. And, some people find that very frustrating and overwhelming. The cornerstone of linguistics is that it moves and changes. That's why we update the dictionary every single year. And so now we have more accessible language. And, I like what Vash said about the fact that so many people think trans masculinity isn't a thing. I thought when I was younger that being trans, in the 80s was, I think the only reference I had to being trans was like a trans woman. And I didn't know what trans men were. I didn't know what non-binary folks were. Although we have existed in all societies and all cultures since the beginning of time. But because the history that we are taught in the school system has not only been whitewashed, it has been ciswashed, and it has been straightwashed as well. And that's why the whole "don't say gay" bill is so dangerous, because if we don't learn who we are, we don't believe in our own existence. We can't have pride in who we are. Transgender has many different definitions. The one that I like is stating that what is assigned to you at birth, because we are not really born boys or born girls. And I know that that's very controversial to say that. We are simply assigned something based on external genitalia. And there's a lot of different combinations that actually go into that. There's chromosomal patterns, there's internal and external genitalia, and being trans is not aligning with what was assigned at birth. And so for some of us, it's being non-binary, which for me is not being man or woman. And for some people, it's being both. Some people, it's being beyond. And I think the more we break down a lot of those definitions, we can better understand each other's experiences. It was, in my generation, it was like 1 out of 10 folks identified as LGBTQ. With Generation Z, which is a lot of the folks that come to Percy's youth group, it's 1 out of 7. And out of those 1 out of 7, 30% of them are using gender neutral pronouns. So whether you believe it in or not, this is the future. This is the direction we're going in. And there's no holding back, folks, once we find out what our truth is and who we really are and what affirms us. So, you know, for a lot of older folks who are like, this is too much, I don't get all this, know that it has always been happening, that we are just able to be more free now about it. And that's with pronouns as well. You know, there's so many different pronouns. And I think that's a really great thing. It's nothing new, though. They've been using they, them pronouns since Shakespeare. Indigenous people used it before the colonizers came over. And I think what scares people about, you know, being transgender or being gender fluid or all of these wonderful things is that what we're really doing is we're challenging these fixed notions that there's this gender binary, that you can only be a man and only be a woman. And that's used as a control tactic. You know, people can say, oh, men are this and women are this, and therefore we can put these gender roles on there that only men are allowed to do this and only women are allowed to do this. But when people like me step outside of that and go, but you know what, I can be masculine, even though I was assigned female at birth, and I can be non-binary, and, you know, I can express myself with whatever name, whatever pronouns, whatever identity, and walk through this world as authentically as possible. And that really scares people and it makes them uncomfortable. But I think that's a good thing, because then that forces change.
Yeah. And I'm really glad you talked about that last piece, because even, you know, my husband, even in our household, you know, there's always, if you look at even my parents, right, there's these gender roles that had stereotypical gender roles that have existed in households for eons, right? And men do certain things and women do other things. And in my household, we all do everything, because guess what? Your underwear are dirty like mine are. You can pick up the dog poop like I do. Like, we don't have those gender roles in this house, because guess what? You eat just like I do, right? So I think even as cis people or as allies, challenging those gender norms as well also helps break down some of these barriers. And how do you see that, Cy or Percy or Bash? And how can people be better allies in this movement, supporting breaking down those gender norms or the binary that exists? Don't all jump in at once.
I think, you know, like you said, like in your kind of your family life, for me, the way that I try to not forcibly educate people, but just get people to think about things that they're used to is, you know, when people say gendered stuff, you know, like, oh, I can't do that, or I'm too young or old to do that, or boys do that, or I'll have my husband do that. I always ask why. You know what I mean? Like, why? And then they're like, because that's what they do. Why? Like, you know, like, can you please don't, not just because that's what they do. Like, why have you guys decided that you're going to affirm something that is made up? If it could be easier to do it a different way, then why wouldn't you? Like, we're in charge of all of this kind of around us. And I just try to get everyone to remember that pretty much every system that we adhere to, we made up. And it's not that big of a deal to do it differently.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, exactly. Like, why? Why are these women's roles and why are these men's roles? And I think, you know, one of the things, although the history of feminism has been very problematic, one of the things that feminists have really pushed is that girls can do everything, and girls should have every opportunity in the world to explore whatever they want to do for a career and express themselves however they want. If girls want to wear pants, they should be able to. I wish that we would really generate that kind of energy into everything. So if little boys want to paint their fingernails, or little boys want to do ballet, you know, as a parent, that is something I really push, is like, as much as I believe my daughter can do everything, my son can do anything he wants either. And when people talk about like being gender neutral with parenting, really be gender neutral with it. And, you know, and do that with everybody, you know, and those gender roles are constructed to basically limit people. Once we take those limitations off, there is so much we can do. I wanted to actually, though, piggyback on something you had said, a question I think you put out there a while ago about how do we counter things. I think education is the biggest thing. I also think visibility, and why today is so important, is also a very big thing for people to know us, to see us, to understand us better. But I also think that one of the things is going back to trans athletes. I hear so much information about it, misinformation, that like people who think they really understand, like I took a biology course in the 8th grade, and I can tell you there's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And, I think, wow, you must have barely passed biology if you think that's what, dictates being a man or being a woman, because there's so many different combinations of chromosomal patterns. And, to look really at what it means to be an athlete, because it's not just based on your genitals. There's so many things that go into being a great athlete. Doesn't, my opinion is that a lot of that stuff should be degendered anyways. It only limits, the athletes themselves if they're, put in categories based on their genitalia. But when people say you're assigned male at birth and therefore you're superior as an athlete, that's rooted in sexism. So that right there is something that we really need to dismantle.
Percy, what are your thoughts on this issue? And Sai, we're going to come back on the athletes part because I know you and I want to rage about that. But Percy, what are your thoughts about how folks can start to destigmatize this issue, and how cis people specifically can be better allies in this space about tearing down gender norms and starting to move this conversation in a new direction?
I think one actionable thing that we can all be more aware of is how we address large groups of people, or even maybe not even like large groups of people, but like a group of people of let's say 5 people. Typically you might walk up to them and be like, hey guys, what's up? Hey guys, how are you doing? And although that doesn't seem like a big deal, a gender neutral term or a more neutral term to use is like, hey everybody, hey y'all, howdy all. And if maybe you're in a more formal setting or it's like a more fancy event, you could be like, hello distinguished guests. So just be aware that your words do have effect on some people. And also another actionable thing I think people could do is don't assume when you meet someone that you know what their pronouns are. Create that space for them to feel safe enough to share their pronouns with you. A good way to do this is to be like, oh, hi. Upon first meeting them, you would be like, hi, I'm Percy. I use he, him pronouns. And then that opens up the conversation for them to be like, oh, this person is aware that, pronouns are important. So I get to share mine as well with them. And it's just a nice moment to create as well. It's just this, it's a nice environment. It's very welcoming.
So Percy, while we have you on, I want to ask you about our schools. Oftentimes LGBTQ plus youth have been experiencing, violence or aggression on campus, especially as they've gone back to school, as they've gone back from, our COVID situation. We've seen an uptick in some of these violence or violent episodes, things like that. So what should schools and school districts be doing to keep our LGBTQ plus youth safe? And frankly, any of our young folks safe, Percy?
Off the bat, I do want to start off with some statistics. So 86% of LGBTQ plus students were harassed at school based on a 2019 study. 2 in 5 LGBTQ students of color were bullied or harassed based on their race and ethnicity, and 84% of trans students felt unsafe at school because of their gender. So all that to say, I think what the school district needs to be doing is to be clearly stating the trans and gender nonconforming youth and just the LGBTQ community as a whole in anti-bullying policies. And so that way, when an occurrence because I'll show you an example, or I'll explain an example. What we hear most often in group are youth sharing experiences of, in the middle of class, one of their peers will say a slur out loud, just in the middle of class. And the teacher won't take that as a teachable moment and will just ignore it and move on with the lesson. And so I think what would be helpful is if the anti-bullying policy clearly stated what to do, the policies and the procedures to follow, the teacher could stop the harassment from continuing in class because they would have a list of steps to follow. Like, this instance happened, so now I'm going to fill out this form and speak with these people about this, and there's going to be consequences for the student that was harassing the LGBTQ student in the middle of class. So there needs to just be a clearly stated protocol of what to do when these things are happening, because you're right, has been an uptick since they have gone back to school in person.
So I just want to remind folks at home, if you're watching and you have questions tonight, we want to answer all of your questions. So please put them in the chat now. We will get to questions in just a few minutes. But we want to get to more questions for our fabulous panel today. So I'm going to keep going, but if y'all have any questions, things you want to know about the day, the special day that's today, please put that in the chat. Sai, I want to come back. Yeah, go ahead, babe.
I just wanted to add, I wanted to piggyback something on what Percy said. Our school board, in actually our legislature in 2017 passed Senate Bill 225, which was providing an opportunity for the school board to come up with a set of guidelines to protect gender diverse youth, because we had in the anti-bullying policy sexuality, race, religion, and things like that, but it really didn't address gender expression, and gender identity. And what happened with that was the bill was passed, and as you know, that was great, and that was a huge victory, but a bill really means nothing unless you implement the guidelines, right? So then it took the school district another, I believe, almost 2 years to figure out what those regulations and guidelines would look like. And we still see it, as Percy is saying, not being applied how it should be. Not every single teacher is being held accountable when a student is being dead named. Not every single principal agrees with these guidelines. So it takes advocates, it takes parents, it takes people to stand up for these kids, but it also takes the school district. The burden is on them to educate every single staff member about these issues, and to tell them about these statistics like what Percy was just talking about, and how impactful it is when they are being supportive.
Sai, you just said a word that I want to make sure folks understand at home. You said dead name. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? And what is that in context of? Like, use that in a sentence so people understand.
So a dead name is a name. Normally, usually it would be like someone's birth name or previous name, or the name that was given to them when they were born. I don't really talk about my dead name a lot, although a lot of folks know it because I've been in this community for a long time. It was a very feminine name. It didn't match my gender identity and how I express myself, so I changed my name a few years ago. It's very inappropriate to ever ask a trans person what their dead name is. And whether you agree or disagree with someone, to be a good ally, to go to what you were saying before about being a good ally, is to never dead name anyone. Like, I don't like Caitlyn Jenner. I think she's a piece of trash, and I think she is not a good I don't think she's a good representative of the trans community by any means, but I will never dead name her. And when people do that, it's a way to erase their trans identity and to invalidate who they are as a trans person.
It was cracking up on screen or off screen when you were talking about Caitlyn Jenner. And Sai, explain the importance of using proper pronouns as well. I don't know that necessarily everybody understand that. I identify as she, her, hers. Everyone identifies maybe differently. You use they, them. And that can also be a continuum. That can be something that is morphing all the time, changing all the time. I often hear from, folks in my family, well, it's just so confusing. Why can't they just pick? Talk to us about how things are fluid and how things maybe continue to change and grow.
Well, I think it's great that people are putting pronouns out there and really talking about them, and people having autonomy over their own pronouns. I've changed my pronouns a lot in the last couple of years because you kind of have to figure out what fits. And you don't know what fits until somebody addresses you, and you don't know what really affirms you until you kind of try it out. There's hundreds of different pronouns. I think people who think there's just these binary concepts, there's only he, him, and she, her, don't really understand linguistics and knowledgeable that in many other language, there are a lot of gender neutral pronouns. One of the limitations of the English language is we don't have a lot of pronouns that really are explaining gender expansiveness. And there are people who use neo pronouns. There are people who use no pronouns, meaning that you would just address them by their name. Some people use all pronouns. I use they, them. And then some people use multi-pronouns. Like if you're a drag performer, maybe during the daytime, you might use he, him pronouns, but at night when you're in drag, you use she, her pronouns. And I love that it's kind of confusing to people because, again, when we're confused and we're uncomfortable, that puts us in a position that we might be able to learn and grow.
All right. I have a few other questions because I know this comes up all the time too. And y'all feel free to hop in, any of you. This is not just for Cy, but Cy and I had a plan going into this, so I want to address some of these things. The other thing I hear constantly from folks who are maybe older, who grew up in a different generation than us, is why are folk reclaiming the word queer? And where is that in the evolution of language?
I think people are reclaiming it because, in every aspect, in every niche, everybody's reclaiming everything. It's kind of an all-inclusive term that can be used in a lot of different ways, and it's easy. Me personally, I don't like using the word for myself, but I don't care who else uses it for whatever reason. I understand older people being triggered, because when they were, where we are now, that word was very different for them. But that's just kind of a part of the suffering of life. Things change, and something that used to hurt doesn't have to hurt anymore. And suffering is a choice. So if this is a thing and you don't like it, that's great. You don't have to, but you're still part of the community that needs your acceptance. So that's pretty much it.
Anyone else want to hop in on that, or any other language changes that have happened over the generations?
So, the word queer, like Bash was saying, when I grew up, it was solely a slur. And it was, and I think a lot of people still see it that way. And when any words are reclaimed, as Bash was saying, some people are going to like it and some aren't. We are not a monolith. We all come from different experiences, and there are words we like and words we don't like. But the gatekeeping of language and things like that is very counterproductive to all of us thriving. Queer was reclaimed in the 90s, and it was reclaimed by a group called Queer Nation, which was an offshoot of ACT UP, which was an HIV/AIDS activist organization. And this was a time when people were demonizing LGBTQ people. And this was a time that we were really forced to stand up for something because the status quo was putting us in this box of being horrible people and getting a disease that we deserved. And so queer was reclaimed as a way to say, we're owning this. But I like queer, and as Bash was saying, it is kind of a word that can be used in many unique ways, but there's still a lot of people who don't like it.
The same thing goes for the word tranny or the word transsexual. There are a lot of trans people who hate both of those words. But I use both of those words for myself. But there are older trans people and even younger trans people that hate both of those terms, like a lot. But I get to say what is true about me.
So you absolutely do. Why should cis people not say those words? And why is it important for cis folk to understand that we don't get to label folk in various ways that might be counterproductive to our transgender friends?
Cis people don't get to say that word because for the most part, their knowledge of the word comes from the slur aspect of that word, so just because they hear one of us say it, it's the same thing as the N-word, you know what I mean? Like, you can't say it at all. You can't sing it, you can't mouth it, and you know why. It's the same thing.
Notice you said it and I did not. Percy, Cy, anything y'all want to add on that?
For the question of with cis folks, I think to understand that a lot of our journeys are still very fragile and very unique, and to be patient with us as we learn about ourselves. And I think one of the things that cis people can do is try to understand that when we come out to you, it is such a big deal. It is such a big thing to verbally say out loud who we are in a world where people don't even want us to exist. And a lot of times I hear from cis allies say, oh, well, you don't need labels. It's not that big of a deal. It is a huge deal. As Bash said earlier, it's how we find our community. So for a lot of us, labels are very, very important. And, if people just disregard it and say, oh, it's just a phase, or you don't have to worry about this, or it's not a big deal, it makes us seem like we're not a big deal. And it really is. And also a lot of times, there's this thing of like, cis people saying, oh, well, I already kind of knew. Like, don't say that, because then that makes us feel like, oh my God, what did we put out there? What kind of clues? Yeah. The best reaction, and I know he's sick of me saying this, but I remember over 2 years ago telling Bash, remember this, Bash, in my office? And I was like, dude, I said, I think I'm trans. I think I'm not cisgender. I think I'm transmasculine. And he said, fuck yeah, you are. That's the kind of energy that you should give anybody who comes out in any way, just 100% affirmation and saying, yes, you are. That's great. And thank you for telling me. Thank you for seeing me as a safe place where you can share that.
So I think oftentimes folks, maybe not who are not even just cisgender, various folk in the community are afraid to fuck up. I know that's something that even I still struggle with. What if I accidentally say the wrong pronoun because I knew Cy in another life, right? And what if I accidentally say the wrong name, right? First of all, I don't think it's that hard, but what happens if you do that and you accidentally say something that maybe you didn't mean to say, but it came out? How do you correct that? And how do you step back and own that you fucked up and we're going to move forward?
I think it is a case by case basis. But oftentimes I think what works best is a quick, oops, sorry, say the right pronoun, move on, but then be conscious and do better. You don't want to find yourself making the same mistake, because the only way you're going to get better is if you practice. And by practice, you got to put the word in your mouth. I'm sorry. It's part of the learning process. You're going to mess up. We know this though. So just say sorry, quickly correct yourself, move on and do better.
And don't make excuses when you do it.
Couldn't agree more. Sai, you said something earlier that I wanted to come back to really quickly before we get to this athlete nonsense that's out there and the bathroom nonsense and all of that bull. You talked about pride, and I think that's a really important thing to talk about in this context, especially of this week. So how has the meaning of pride changed for all of you since the days of Stonewall when pride first began? And how has that kind of morphed to be hopefully more inclusive of the various communities?
Well, it's interesting, Annette, I love queer history. It's just, I'm a nerd with it. And I think a lot of people do think that that's what Stonewall was it really catapulted the gay pride movement. But we actually had, gay pride organizations before Stonewall. We had the Daughters of Bilitis, and we had groups who were doing marches and who were doing events. And Stonewall was just kind of the tipping point, That's when the queer community really came out and said, we're not going to take this anymore. And Stonewall was led by trans and gender non-conforming people. It was not cisgender white gay guys throwing the bricks at the cops. It was people who were really othered within the queer community. The trans community has always been shoved aside when it comes to the gay rights movement. And maybe for a lot of us, that's why we didn't come out as soon as we wanted to, because we wanted to be embraced by the LGBTQ community, and the T is often thrown aside. And I think that that's a shame, because all the things that we are fighting for when it comes to, gender expression and it comes to public accommodations, it benefits everybody in the queer community and outside of the queer community. And when I think of pride, I think of autonomy over my own existence, my own, labels, my own language, all of those things. That's the pride I have. And I think, unfortunately, and Bash and I have had a lot of discussions about this, there's a lot of transphobia within the queer community. One of the things we saw when Elliot Page came out was a lot of lesbians saying, oh, well, we lost a great leader. And there goes another lesbian to being gender nonconforming. And really, if you look at the history, if you look at lesbian history, you see a lot of gender nonconforming folks. You see lesbians using he, him pronouns decades ago. But I think there's this sense that the trans community is so separated, and there are people who do not like us, being within the queer community because they think that it's so intrinsically different, that we have sexual orientation and we have gender identity. And while they are two different categorizations, a lot of the things that we are fighting for, a lot of the policies and things like that benefit both of us. And for most of us, our sexual kind of awakening, our queer awakening, is also something considered when we look at our gender awakening. A lot of times it overlaps, and we find ourselves not only through our gender expression, but through our sexuality. So, I think it really just comes down to our community and how we treat and uplift each other and support each other and see each other.
Bash, same question for you around pride and the movement as a whole.
My feelings about pride are varied. I spent a lot of time, like I said, as a lesbian, and it was easy to be that way. And so like going to pride was just like going to pride. Now it's a little bit different for me because like here locally, I don't feel like we're catered to in the slightest. So yes, I want to be there and I want to build up my community, but I don't feel like that community necessarily wants to help me do that. So I think, it's important to have personal pride. And I don't know. I got mixed feelings right now. It's kind of like a hot issue for me to talk about. So I don't really know how to answer properly.
There is no proper answer. I appreciate you just sharing your opinion on it because I think it's important to hear, because I think you're right. That space has so historically been about the L and the G, and, now maybe the B a little more. But I think oftentimes our T friends of the kind of alphabet soup that Sai was talking about are left out of that important conversation.
And not only that not just that we're left out, but when we are included, it's only to one of us. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's only trans women who are catered to, if trans people are catered to at all. And it's only one type of trans women. And, that's not fair either, because trans women come in all shapes, sizes, and forms, so it's really damaging to see this very, very small pinhole of representation, when we get any at all. Thank you.
Percy, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I completely agree with Bash, where it's almost like there's a disconnect that seems to be happening, where if there is any light shed on the trans community, it is only on one specific trans journey. And on the trans mask side of that, it's usually like the white skinny boy, which I am not. But it's like, hey, we exist and we're great. So there just seems to be a disconnect, and I don't know where that comes from, but I would hope that in more generations, and I'm actually seeing it with the youth that we have at Qvolution, where it's just like they inherently get it, that this trans journey that is beautiful is for everyone, and it's all valid. And so right now where I'm at for Pride is I want the youth to realize that their journey is their own, and that's beautiful, and they're great because of it.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to bring down the mood a little more. Sai, let's talk about this insanity that's going on around the country, where everybody's afraid of transgender folk. Everybody thinks they're coming in our bathrooms, creeping on our little girls, all the nonsense I've heard at the legislature and all around on these ridiculous bills, harmful bills. And now we have, athletes who identify as transgender who are, just trying to participate in a sport. I was a swimmer myself back in the day. You see various athletes coming into sports, talking about these issues. Talk to me about why this is so ridiculous and how the right has just used this as a wedge issue. And it's so harmful to real human beings who are going through this.
Well, first of all, let's talk about bathrooms. I think one of the issues with bathrooms is how they're designed, especially in this country. And if you've traveled around the world, you see that in other countries, bathrooms are much different. They don't have like these 2-inch gaps in between the door and the stall where you feel like extra vulnerable with anybody coming in. But the thing about bathrooms is when people go to the bathrooms, they just want to go to the bathroom, hopefully wash their hands and leave. There's never been one incident historically. And I always challenge folks when, especially if I present to like law students, I say, find me one case. And nobody has, in the 20 years that I've been teaching this, to find one incident of a trans person who's going into a restroom to assault someone. Because anybody can go into a restroom and hide in a stall. You really don't need to dress a certain way or act a certain way to have access to a restroom. However, there have been multiple cisgender, straight male Republicans who have gone into bathrooms to assault people. So I think that if we really want to shine a light on the dangers in bathrooms, it's these Republicans who are getting caught in bathrooms doing things they shouldn't be doing. Now, that aside, let's talk about athletes. The Olympic Committee has already addressed trans athletes. They've had guidelines on the books for over 10 years. They've addressed this. What they're looking at is estrogen levels and testosterone levels. If we really boil it down to that women are inherently inferior to men in every way, I would dare any tennis player to go up against Serena Williams. She would beat most of the men in any division. I think sports, again, should be degendered. It should be based on weight. It should be based on ability, things like that, but it shouldn't be based on gender. Again, this is just something that people are using as a way to not only tear down trans people, but to separate people in athletics. All of these bills are designed to make us look like horrible, scary predators who are trying to take things that don't belong to us, whether it's access to a bathroom or a locker room or some kind of a trophy or some kind of a record. So, and I think, for the trans athletes that are excelling, you simply have to look at their journey. And their journey isn't one where it's a cisgender man who is, pretending to be a woman to break a record. And when I think about the lawmakers that are saying the things they are, like Ted Cruz, who last week said during a hearing that, well, if I want to be this, I can just be that. And it was interesting because he said, I'm a man. If I say I'm a woman, I'm a woman. I was like, hey, Ted, welcome to the community. I'm so glad you came out as a woman. I think that's great. So until he says otherwise, I'm going to treat Ted Cruz as a woman because he stated that. And I think that's so great. Maybe it'll do something for the Republican Party that he came out as a woman. I think it's fantastic. So.
I love you so much. All I see with Ted Cruz is the Zodiac killer, but that's just me. What do y'all think about this issue, Percy, Bash? I want to get your opinion on this and see where y'all are at on these types of, harmful things that move through.
For the bathrooms, I agree pretty much largely with Sai. Before I came out, I used the men's bathroom on a regular basis just because I didn't like waiting in line and I didn't see an issue. Like if a guy sees me walk in here, like what's he gonna do? Pee on me? So I think it's, just like fear, and I think the people who are saying the hypotheticals and the what ifs, they get that line of thinking because those are the type of things they wish they could do. So yeah, that's why they're afraid other people will do that, because if they could, they would. For the sports thing, I also, once again, I played football for 7 years, and I couldn't imagine being told that I couldn't play because of something like this. Like, I played on a national level. I was on ESPN. Like, we were a very, very good team. And even though there was no way for me to continue that, like, if that had become like my passion and I lost it, I would probably become a very angry person after that. I think we're missing out on maybe a potential opportunity for some cool science, like, because I don't know. I just think if we open ourselves up to the idea that this could be a moment of evolution, like natural evolution, putting AFAB and ABAB bodies together in these stressful situations, like, what if that was the way we evolved as humans? I think that would be cool to kind of find out. And I think, like, we have this culture of violence where there are women that are very comfortable in the knowledge that the man they're with might beat their ass, and they're okay with this. But then you look at combat sports and you're like, oh, well, we shouldn't be putting men and women together in combat sports. Your boyfriend literally slapped you when you woke up. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we have all these contradictions from people who, what's the word? They are hypocritical in their beliefs, where in one arena it's okay, in another arena it's totally immoral. And I think that's just a lot of missed opportunity for growth for all of us.
Percy?
I'll start off with the bathrooms. This came up the other day in group, and one thing I know is that the future is going to be all right, because the solution the youth came up with was gender neutral bathrooms everywhere, gender neutral locker rooms everywhere. And I was like, y'all are geniuses. You solved it. Great. Let's do it now. Let's make it a reality. So that's my piece on bathrooms. Sai and Bash covered everything else wonderfully. As far as sports, at the end of the day, what's happening is we're taking wonderful opportunities away from kids. And that's not something we should be okay with ever, across the board. And so the fact that it's even happening, and it continues to happen again and again, and that it's happening at like the Olympic level also, like that is like the pinnacle of like performance and athleticism. And if they're not safe to perform and compete at that level, like what chances do like a T-ball team have? So again, these are kids that we're talking about, and I feel like that doesn't get highlighted enough. These are children that we're taking the rights away of, children that we're taking just all these wonderful opportunities away from.
You know what I find interesting, and Sai, I want to bring you back in for this one because I have a hot take on this. I was sitting here listening to y'all talking about this, and like I said, I swam all through high school. I was in marching band all through high school. I was in student council all through high school. All of those things were co-ed things. We practiced swimming together. Hell, sometimes the locker rooms were together because you were in rural Nevada and there were no locker rooms and you just had to get changed and do your thing. And, we all learned how to PE change and do that kind of stuff. And so for me, it's just like, it was funny when I was a kid and I was in swimming, I didn't even think about it. I just did what I needed to do and got in the pool and started swimming, regardless of, the person who was next to me. And so I feel like our young folks today, regardless of whether they're in the trans community or not, don't even think about this stuff. They have been around folks who are different from them their entire lives. And it's not until they become older and are taught to hate other people or taught to see people as the other, because these things are taught. These are learned behaviors. This is hatred, and being a transphobic person or a homophobic person is a learned behavior. These young folks don't even know when they're in the pool that the person next to them is trans or male or female or whatever. And so I don't see the big deal with it. And if I had a child, I would encourage them to, not make a big deal of it. I don't know. Am I off base here, Sai?
No, I think, and again, here's where I think we need to listen to young people more. And I think it was very powerful when Percy was able to facilitate that youth group, because there was this whole audience of parents and teachers listening to these young people and how they feel about these things. And, it's very similar to when we have this conversation about, and Annette, you and I have been for years talking about this. When we talk about sex ed in schools, right? Kids are like, we want to learn. We want to know this information. The majority of kids want to know that. It's the parents who are stopping it. And it's the same thing when we're talking about, gender diverse youth. Most young people don't care who's in the locker rooms. They don't care who's on the teams. They want everybody to play. And they, when you look at young people and how they're protesting now and walking out of their schools, that's not just the LGBTQ kids, that's their friends. That's the students who are in the classrooms with them. They are supporting each other. It's the parents and the adults who are having such a hard time wrapping their mind around young people having autonomy over who they are. And it scares them. And the only thing that I find some kind of like hope in is like what Percy was saying, is that they are the future. Like Gen Z, millennials, they're taking over. They are leading these protests and these revolutions. And you know what? They're going to be a huge voting bloc in a couple of years. The boomers, they're dying out, and that ideology is dying out. So whether they understand it or not, these young people are leading the way, and they are supporting their peers in being free and being on sports teams and being a part of things. So I find I am, my little queer heart is warmed by this next generation sticking up for each other and wanting those things, because they're not bothered by it. When you poll these young people, they don't care. They're okay with it. It's their parents who are stuck on things.
Yeah. I have completely different feelings than my boomer parents. And on a regular basis, I remember that they are boomers and remind them of that fact. Okay, let's move to audience questions because we have a few really great ones. My friend Laura Levitt asks, are barriers to healthcare being addressed or improving, and what can be done in this area? So Percy, I'm actually going to start with you on this one.
I know where the center is located, we're a bit of a pharmacy desert. Folks have to travel like miles to the nearest pharmacy to get what they need for the day-to-day. So as far as that, we are definitely doing our best to address change and to meet people where they're at and give them access to resources that are, that could potentially be life-saving. And our hope, I believe, is to have our own like clinic, have our own like off-standing clinic maybe. So as far as the center is concerned, that is always our hope and our goal, to better meet the needs of folks. So.
Sai.
Well, with healthcare, I think the biggest thing is education. 80% of medical students are never given any kind of diversity training in their curriculum on how to support LGBTQ plus patients. So I think the first thing is education. And I think for them to know that most of us stay in the closet about our sexuality and our gender identity because we know that we are going to be discriminated against on some level in healthcare. I think it's great that there are a lot of doctors now who are understanding the importance of affirming these patients, because what happens when you don't is that we don't seek healthcare. We see gaps in care. We see, people not go in for, we saw this during COVID, people not wanting to go and get tested or to go, get the vaccine because of their healthy mistrust of the medical, systems. So for me, I always think education is the biggest key, but it's also about these medical systems changing in how they see trans healthcare, and they understand that it's not just identifying as trans. I mean, folks like me who are non-binary also get gender affirming procedures done and might also be on hormone replacement therapy and things like this. So really looking at healthcare in a really inclusive way when it comes to gender diversity.
Ash?
Yeah, I kind of just want to echo what Sai said. I think the one of the biggest barriers besides the lack of education is the trauma that comes from that lack of education. Myself, you know, I never had a problem going to the doctor until I came out as trans. And in the last 3 years, I've had the most traumatizing experiences in my life trying to access transitional care, you know, and I think besides the education, the fact that doctors are humans and humans can be trash, you know, is a problem. And it sucks, like, you know, because even the fact that the trauma's been done, once they're educated, I still don't want to go if I don't have to, you know what I mean? And I think not only educating doctors, but trying to build a community. Like, people used to have their primary care physician for their whole life and their whole family went to one. And now they're moving constantly all the time, or you're on Medicaid and the care is just, you know, it's less than. Like, and I don't think that's ever going to change with education. I think that's always going to be one of the barriers, is the type of healthcare that you have will determine the type of care you get. And that's unfortunate.
Absolutely. I'm gonna throw this next question out to the group. Some will say being transgender is new. This is from Maria, by the way. Some will say being transgender is new, but there's a history of trans folks that we do not widely know about. How can we prove that transgender folks have been around as long as people have been around and it's nothing new? Y'all go ahead and start, whoever wants to.
I'll say that, again, most of our history has been erased. Most of our history is not talked about. I didn't know, there was a question earlier about visibility. I didn't know of any trans people when I was a kid, any famous trans. I think the first person that I ever heard about, like, maybe being trans was when Chaz Bono came out. And I was living in Los Angeles at the time. And so it was a really big deal when he came out. And, you know, like Buck Angel was another trans man who was very famous. And there's just not a lot of representation. And again, when you don't see yourself in media, then, you know, you don't know that you exist. There's a very good movie on Netflix called Disclosure, which is a great documentary about the history of trans representation in film and television, and how a lot of it was very problematic. In most, you know, stories, we were victims, or we were villains, or, you know, we were crazy and unstable. And so when you see that, you don't see positive portrayals and representations in those things, then you think less of yourself and you have less pride. So I think it's important. And now that we have so many more trans characters and non-binary characters, I think this next generation seeing that, I think it does so much to affirm, you know, who they are.
I personally think Disclosure was great. And it also taught me, like, with this question, when people say, oh, everyone's got pronouns now, everyone's trans now, like, it's brand new. Like, I think we need to be frank with the people who say this, because I'm only 33 and I remember very vividly that what's happening now is the exact playbook of what happened to gay people 30, 50 years ago. They were pedophiles, they were degenerates, they were delinquents, they were all these things. And, you know, it was just fear. And now we know that gay people aren't pedophiles. They're not weird or other. They're just gay, and that's it. Like, it's just a thing about them. So I think we need to remind these people that, remember when we were kids and you had an uncle that didn't come, like, and now that's your favorite, you know what I mean? Like, this is the exact same thing that just happened to the L's and the G's 30 years ago. Like, you don't see that? It's not new. We've been here. It's just we're tired of hiding and we're not doing it anymore. And we don't owe you proof of our existence.
Absolutely. Percy, you want to add anything on that one?
If anyone wants to know a little bit more about queer history and the fact that we have been here since the very beginning, there's a very good book, very easy to follow. It's called The Queer History of the United States for Young People. It's not just for young people. Anyone is, you know, welcome to read it, but it's specifically about the United States. And I think one of my favorite people they talk about in the book is someone who came over during the first, like, and people who crossed over, like the Pilgrim era. I can't recall the date. But they were non-binary. They went by public universal friends, and no one thought it was weird. This colony was just like, yeah, that's public universal friends. They exist, they're there. And that was like a leader in the community. They were a pillar of the community, and it was just the way it was, and everything was copacetic. So definitely recommend that book, and then read more books about queer history. It's really fun and cool, and I can't recommend it enough.
We probably shouldn't tell the Republicans that history books exist about transgender people, because they'll try to ban those as well as they do, all of the other history books that they don't like. Anyways, I just bought a whole bunch of the books that Ted Cruz held up during the Supreme Court nominee hearing, because I was like, well, if he hates it, I love it. Let's do this. The anti-racist baby. I was like, yes, let me get him for all of the children in my life. Anyways, anything Ted Cruz doesn't love, I absolutely adore. So next question is from Will. Are there things that cis allies do that you feel are counterproductive or harmful to your movement?
I think comparing traumas, I always call it like the oppression Olympics. When they say, oh, you must be hard being misgendered. Yeah, somebody thought, I was a girl once. And I'm like, it's not comparable, I also, it's a thing of having sympathy or empathy. Like, there are things that I can never empathize with, but I can at least listen and try to understand. And, I think for me, having once identified as cis and not understanding that, but now getting it and now understanding what that means and how the world sees me and or doesn't see me. But I think for cisgender folks, it's like any other kind of allyship. It's about knowing that it's a constant learning. Like, you cannot rest. And about speaking up for us when we're not around. And just being an active ally, being someone who, when somebody, like Bash was saying earlier, somebody says something that's really problematic, say something. If you're in a safe space, like, I wouldn't want you to jeopardize your job or anything like that, but counter it if you can and say, I hear what you're saying, but that's actually really not rooted in anything. And do that, stand up for us. And in all places, in your workplace, within your friend group, and especially if you're in the queer community, stand up for it, because there's so much transphobia in our own community. Like, if we can't protect each other, then what good are we?
Two problematic things that I think cis people do are they look at their allyship as, I don't know how to word this, but their allyship is like, it's only theirs. And because they're an ally, they don't feel a responsibility to hold the people around them accountable, because they're an ally. But, my grandpa's old and he's from a different time and he's just like that. You know what I mean? I don't think that's an excuse. And I don't think you get to come and sit next to me and try to be all my ally when you know that there's someone that when I leave is going to say something crazy and you're just going to leave and go to or brush it off. So I think not holding the people around them accountable is a problem. Just because they're not in the community, they're community adjacent, it's still their responsibility as much as it is mine. Another thing is they get really excited when they learn that you're in the community and they want you to know that they're an ally. And so what a lot of times they'll do is they'll out the people in their life to build that rapport with you. Like, oh, I have a trans friend or a non-binary friend. And then they'll talk about them, sometimes misgender them. You know what I mean? Like I understand that you're an ally, but you don't need to tell me you're an ally, because I can see if you're an ally or not. So outing people around you or bringing up my transition out of nowhere without me bringing it up is a little bit problematic, because you don't know where I stand with it or how comfortable I am or how comfortable the people you are outing are with you talking to me about this. So, yeah.
Thank you for that, Bash. Percy?
They covered it. Both of them covered it. So good on y'all.
Okay. Couple other questions, if that's okay. And Laura, you're our favorite boomer. She says visibility is so important, not only in entertainment, but in government. For example, the head of HHS, Rachel Levine. And I think that is such a good example of how things have changed for the better. So we love you, Laura. Don't worry, you're our favorite boomer. Maria Teresa asks, who threw the first brick and why should we honor them?
Well, so we don't know. There wasn't any media coverage really at all on Stonewall. And that's one of the biggest problems is that riot lasted for days. And there was a lot that happened. There were hundreds of people involved in that riot. And like I said, it was one of the tipping points in queer history that really propelled Pride as a movement. But and we don't know that that Marsha Johnson was even there in the beginning. A lot of people like to kind of put her up on this pedestal of like that she threw the first brick. We don't know. And people who were there in New York City when it happened would tell you that Marsha was actually across town working. Her and Sylvia were working. They came by later on in the night, but I think it's kind of like this thing that people like to put out there. The thought is that Stormy, who was a very butch lesbian gender non-conforming activist, was one of the first people to throw the brick, but we don't know. And the problem is, again, a lot of that has been so whitewashed. There's a movie that came out a couple of years ago called Stonewall, and it's so horrible because all it shows is these young white gay cisgender men going up against the cops. And that's not what happened at all. It was really, again, mostly disenfranchised people within our community who were trans and gender nonconforming and butch lesbians and drag performers and sex workers and people who were so often tossed aside within the movement. Those are the folks who led the revolution during Stonewall.
Thank you for that. I love all the history we're learning. Maria Teresa was like, this is fascinating in our chat just now. Shelby asks, when trans young people are on their parents' health care, is there any option for them to access care without getting permission? And I know, Sai, this is something we've been working on kind of session after session. You want to talk about that?
And unfortunately, there's not. I wish there were some like ways to kind of get around that system, but unfortunately there isn't. And even if you're younger and you want to change your name, that's a legal process, and usually you have to have a guardian or a parent involved in that. There are a lot of really great resources on the internet. There's a organization called Plume, Plume. I think the actual website is like Get Plume or Go Plume, and it's where you can find trans affirming healthcare in every single city, in every single state, if they have it in those cities. And even if you're young, you can access that and try to find something. But if you're on your parents' health care, or, in most cases, you need a parent or a guardian to go with you to those places. Unfortunately, there just really isn't a lot you can do outside of that. And unfortunately, what happens when you don't have access to healthcare, whether you're an adult or a child, you end up going underground for healthcare. You end up trying to access testosterone or estrogen or procedures outside of safe medical spaces.
All right. And our final question of the evening is, how can having Trans Day of Visibility, Trans Week of Visibility, help the mental health of trans folks, and especially trans youth, who don't often see people like them? And I'll let whoever wants to start. Percy, you want to go first?
I am going to mention the Don't Say Gay bill again as a starting point. By not talking about varied and diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and gender experiences, it's almost like they want to say that these people aren't adults. There's no adults that identify this way out there. And so kids aren't going to learn about it, and they're not going to be able to find themselves in history or on the pages of whatever book they're reading. And so I forgot the question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Don't say sorry. Corey, how can having Trans Day of Visibility help folks who are trans youth or just trans folks who don't often see people like them?
So all that to say that when we have these days and these weeks and these special moments during the year where we highlight the fact that there are trans adults that exist and they're making changes and they are thriving. They're not just living, they're thriving and they have happy, beautiful lives. The youth get to see that and be like, oh, that could be me one day. There's hope for me. I see myself in this person. And it's a note. It gives them a beat to be like, okay, right now, what I'm going through isn't the best. I'm not feeling great, but there is hope for my future because I can see all these wonderful people that already exist and have paved the way for me.
Ash, you want to go next?
I think Percy covered it pretty well. I think also being around your community, like for me, it makes me want to be more involved in both my own life and my community. Like when I see people and they're all together and they're all, comfortable, I want to do more to make that possible more often. So I want to educate myself on what's available to us, where we're accepted, or where's a comfortable place for us to congregate, like all those things besides being affirmed in who I am, seeing older people and being excited by seeing younger people. The energy I feel just is like let's make this better. Let's make this possible for everybody because everybody deserves to feel like this.
And Sai with our grand finale.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was muted there. I think I compare it to like being a kid in the 80s and not seeing a lot of like gay characters on TV. And we were told when we were younger that gay people couldn't grow up and get married and have kids because there were laws against that. There were laws against us just being, intimate with each other. There were sodomy laws that prevented that. But yet, here we are decades later, able to legally get married, legally adopt people, be in relationships, with people that we want to be. And I hope that trans kids and gender diverse kids can look and see that these are adults who are, as Percy said, thriving, and they are in relationships and they are in every aspect of work and government and the arts. And when they see that, then they believe they can do it too. It's like any other marginalized community. When somebody breaks through any kind of ceiling, it gives those young people the belief that they can do it as well. And then they do. So, yeah.
And Sai, how do folks get in touch or involved with gender justice? I know y'all are doing great work in the community all the time. I know so many of your board members and love them. How do folks get involved and how do they support your work?
I always say, I'm going to put it in the chat. I would say the best way to get a hold of me is just to text. You can email too, and that's fine. But text me. And then, you can say, hey, can we have a conversation? Can we meet up for coffee? Can we partner on some projects? So I'm going to put my phone number in the text there. It's 702-324-1271.
Just know we're live streaming this, Sai. So
fine.
This is going out to America. Okay.
That's cool. Call me.
We're like 25 people in Las Vegas and Northern Nevada that are watching.
That's okay. They can do that. We have a website too, genderjusticeenvy.org. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. I'm on TikTok, so I do a lot of queer history and terminology and just have a really good time on TikTok. So I'm the Gender Rebel on TikTok if you want to follow that. But yeah, just text me if you have any questions. That's the best way to get a hold of me, is just to text me.
It's true. I text you all the time. Talk shit. Percy, how do folks get involved with the center in downtown Las Vegas and all of the good work y'all are doing?
If you are interested in volunteering, we are always looking for volunteers. I'll put it in the chat, but it's thecenterlv.org if you're interested in volunteering with us. And if you want to reach out to me or if you have any questions, I will also put my email in the chat. It's pneavez@thecenterlv.org. Again, this will all be in the chat if you ever have any questions or need more information about the services that we provide at the center.
Yes. And for folks at home watching, please get involved with both of these organizations. Sai is one of my buddies, and we rabble rouse together all the time, talk a lot of shit. So if y'all want to get involved with the good work that these two groups are doing, please get involved. All of their information will be in the chats tonight. So we want you to raise your voice if you're an ally, or if you're part of the transgender community, get involved with their good work. For folks at home, we will be back next Thursday with another Out in Front. We will be talking about insulin prices and the new bill that was moved through the House of Representatives today that many of our representatives voted for. So we're very excited about that, on capping insulin prices. And the importance of prescription drug reform. So make sure you join us for that episode next week. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this very important episode talking about our transgender community and the Transgender Week of Visibility. And I want to thank all of my friends here tonight for joining us and sharing your thoughts and opinions and stories with us. So thank you for being so open and honest. And for those of you at home, thanks for joining us every Thursday at 5 p.m. We will be back next week, Thursday, 5 p.m. So don't be late. Talk to you all soon, and have a great evening, everyone, and stay safe.